Tales of Thorinis, Episode 4, Echoes in the Night. Nyx and Deus roamed the city, their search for Favi growing more desperate with each passing hour. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows that crept between the alleys. They had combed through every place Favi might have been, starting with the guard post where his obsession with retrieving his lost equipment might have drawn him, to the local taverns where unfinished business or old grudges could have led him into a brawl. Yet, despite their relentless search, there wasn't a hint of him. Even Julius, usually so easy to find, seemed to have vanished since they last saw him. Deus broke the uneasy silence. "Do you think he did something to Julius?" His voice held a tinge of concern, the weight of unspoken fears hanging in the air. Nyx shot him a sideways glance, shaking off the dark thoughts that threatened to cloud his mind. "Deus, stop it. They're probably just off somewhere. Don't jump to conclusions." He tried to sound confident, but something in his tone wavered. His thoughts churned, paranoia creeping in like a fog. The blades he carried seemed to radiate an uncomfortable warmth, as if sensing the tension between them. "I shouldn't be carrying these. Not like this. Not again." "Did you say something?" Deus asked, eyeing Nyx with suspicion. "What? No, I mean..." Nyx realized he'd spoken his thoughts aloud. He clenched his fists and shook his head, trying to clear the haze. "Get a grip, damn it!" Deus raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. Nyx and Favi, with their unpredictable ways, had always intrigued him. They were a far cry from the rigid, honor-bound paladins he had grown up around. They represented something freer, wilder, a complete departure from the life he had known within the castle walls. But now, their unpredictability gnawed at him, especially when it came to Favi's sudden disappearance. The search led them to the harbor, a place teeming with merchants, sailors, and shady figures. As they asked around, trying to piece together any information, Deus's attention was pulled away by a loud voice calling from the direction of the local brothel. A burly man with a familiar sneer approached, the same bodyguard who had accosted Deus not long after their arrival on the island. "Hey, giant," the man bellowed, swaggering up to them. "I'll see you at the inn tonight, eh?" He extended a rough hand in greeting, a smirk on his face. Deus met the gesture with a grin of his own. "Of course, but first we've got a bit of a problem on our hands. 2 of our friends have gone missing. We've been searching for them all day." The man scratched his chin, feigning concern. "Oh, what a shame. But hang on a minute." His eyes gleamed with sudden recognition. "You're not talking about that prick in black armor, are you? And his little squire?" Deus's eyes widened with enthusiasm. "Exactly, yes." The bodyguard let out a rough chuckle. Well, you're in luck. I saw those 2 earlier this morning. I was stumbling out of the inn, could barely stand to be honest. When I spotted them heading toward the harbor gate, didn't seem like they were in any hurry, but I've no idea what they were up to. The black-armored one, he's got a reputation, you know. Tough bastards like him usually come back from that cursed forest crying pants full of shit. He laughed heartily at his own joke, shaking his head. Nyx and Deus exchanged glances, a spark of hope lighting their features. "Thanks for the tip," Deus said, clapping the man on the shoulder. As they turned to leave, Deus added, "See you tonight," with a quick wave. With renewed purpose, they made their way toward the harbor gate, the urgency of their mission pushing them forward. Nyx couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The pieces were falling into place, but something still felt wrong. Passing the guards, Nyx and Deus entered the forest, a place that felt as if life itself had been sucked from the air. The stillness was oppressive. Not even the wind dared to stir the leaves. The grove stretched before them, resembling a desolate battlefield. Trees, once towering and proud, lay shattered across the forest floor, their trunks splintered and broken. Scarlet leaves, stained with blood, fluttered gently to the ground. The remains of entrails were scattered like a grotesque mosaic across the scene, painting a picture of violence and death. Deus moved with caution, keeping an eye on Nyx, who was visibly unraveling. Nyx's thoughts spiraled into chaos as he took in the carnage. His heart pounded against his chest like a caged beast, his mind consumed by the horrors of his past, long-buried memories clawing their way to the surface. "Kill them!" The words echoed in his mind, louder and louder, a sinister command that threatened to overtake him. He clenched his fists, trying to keep control, but the darkness was pushing in. Deus, noticing Nyx's fragile state, decided to act quickly. His sharp ears picked up a faint sound, heavy, labored breathing. Following it, he wove through the wreckage until he spotted Julius, half hidden in the bushes, slumped and broken. His face was battered, his clothes soaked with blood that had seeped through from wounds barely hidden by the torn fabric. "Dear Innos," Deus whispered as he crouched down, gently lifting Julius from the cold earth. The bard's face was pale, his body trembling from pain and exhaustion. Turning back to Nyx, whose mental state showed no sign of improving, Deus heard a rustling from the nearby bushes. His instincts kicked in as he covered Nyx with his body, hoisting Julius over his shoulder and gripping his sword tightly in his free hand. From the shadows, a figure emerged, Bosper, the hunter, bow drawn and suspicion etched across his face. "Who are you?" Bosper demanded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the scene. "And what have you done to them, beast?" Deus, his voice strained but firm, replied, "My name is Deus, former royal guard. I'm here to help. I didn't do this." He motioned towards Julius and Nyx with a nod. Bosper studied him for a long moment before lowering his bow, though his suspicion remained. "Where's Farvi?" "I haven't found him yet," Deus answered, his voice quick and urgent. "But Julius is in bad shape. We need help now." Bosper wasted no time. The two worked swiftly, Deus tearing Julius's shirt open to give Bosper access to the brutal wounds. The hunter worked with practiced hands, packing the wounds with herbs that stung and bled fresh with each application. Nyx stood nearby, watching the process as if in a trance, his mind still teetering on the edge of chaos. Each new gush of blood from Julius's pale skin was like a hammer to Nyx's psyche, driving deeper into his fragile mental state. Julius, even in his pain, glanced at Deus, his eyes silently asking what's happening to Nyx. But Deus, just as lost, could only shake his head. He didn't know. None of them did. Once Julius was stabilized, Bosper shot to his feet, determined to find Farvi. The search didn't last long. A short distance away, Bosper stumbled upon the body of a massive beast slumped against a rock wall. The creature lay motionless, its mouth agape, a pool of dried blood beneath it. Bosper approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the beast for any sign of Farvi, and then he saw it. There, inside the beast's maw, Farvi's head, held in the jaws of death. The warrior had somehow driven a dagger into the monster's throat in his final moments, freezing them both in a grisly tableau. Farvi's last breath had been spent killing the creature, just as it was about to tear his head from his body. The sight burned itself into Bosper's memory. He would never forget this moment. "Deus!" Bosper shouted, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "You need to see this." The sound of Deus running toward him seemed to awaken something in Farvi. His eyes snapped open, and with a guttural scream, he wrenched his dagger free and stabbed wildly at the monster's neck, his blows fueled by sheer adrenaline and terror. Farvi screamed, sinking the blade in again and again, even as the beast lay long dead. Bosper lunged forward, grabbing Farvi's hand to stop him. "Get this thing off him already," he shouted to Deus. Deus, summoning every ounce of strength his augmented body possessed, wrapped his arms around the creature's legs and heaved. With a single smooth motion, he pulled the massive body off Farvi, freeing his friend from the suffocating weight. Bosper moved quickly, administering a strange potion to Farvi that knocked him out cold within seconds. The warrior's body finally relaxed, his breathing slowing. Bosper, visibly exhausted, slumped to the ground beside Farvi. "All right," he huffed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Take care of your mate. The guard will be here soon to take Farvi and Julius back to my quarters. We'll get them patched up there." Deus nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, on Nyx, whose distant gaze still lingered on the blood-soaked scene before them. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Time passed in a heavy silence as the bodies of Favi and Julius were carried off to receive treatment. Deus kept a watchful eye on Nyx, sitting just a short distance away, trying to offer some comfort with his presence. Nyx's hands trembled as he fumbled with something in his pocket, eventually pulling out his small sachet of swamp herb. His movements were nervous, almost frantic, as he twisted a pipe together with shaky fingers. The herb had always been his crutch, his way to dull the sharp edges of reality when it became too unbearable. After a couple of failed attempts to light it, Nyx grumbled in frustration. Without a word, the two of them made their way into a nearby cave, seeking shelter from the creeping dusk. There, Nyx leaned in close to Deus, and with a click, the lighter built into Deus's chest sparked to life, igniting the pipe. Nyx took a deep inhale, holding the smoke in until it filled his lungs. Slowly, he exhaled, and the nightmares that had plagued his mind began to dissipate like papers blown away by the wind. His body relaxed, and for the first time that day, his thoughts slowed to something bearable. Deus, still struggling to make sense of everything, decided to break the heavy atmosphere with some levity. Can I try?" he asked, his voice light but curious. Nyx, now in a far more relaxed state, let out a thick cloud of smoke and chuckled. Are you sure it won't twist the screws out of your skull?" Deus grinned, his confidence unwavering. "Not the sort of thing I've tried before, Nyx, but I'm built for it." With that, he mimicked Nyx's movements, inhaling deeply and letting the smoke fill the space where his head should be. The sight of the smoke billowing from Deus's mechanical body sent Nyx into a fit of laughter, and before long they were both sitting in the cave telling ridiculous stories and laughing like old friends who had no care in the world. For over an hour the cave echoed with their laughter. It was a brief, almost surreal reprieve from the chaos and violence that had engulfed their lives. But as the moments passed and the high began to wear off, Nyx's mind turned back to the dark questions that had been gnawing at him. He leaned back against the cool stone wall, his expression thoughtful. "What is it about all of this?" Nyx murmured almost to himself. "These blades, do they give me power, or does it come from me? I can't tell anymore." His fingers brushed against the hilts of the blades at his side. They felt cool now, a stark contrast to the warmth they had radiated earlier when his mind had been spiraling. It was as if the state of the blades was tied directly to his emotions, responding to his inner turmoil. Deus watched him quietly, sensing the weight of Nyx's thoughts but unsure of what to say. Nyx sighed, his brow furrowing in frustration. "I don't have anyone to ask about this. Favi's out cold, Julius too, and who knows when they'll be themselves again. I guess I'll have to figure it out on my own." The two sat in silence for a moment, the echoes of their earlier laughter still lingering in the air. Outside the cave, the light began to fade, and the first breath of cool air signaling the approach of sunset swept through the trees. It stirred something in them, an unspoken reminder that the world outside was still moving, still waiting for them. Nyx stood, stretching his limbs, now more composed but still burdened by unanswered questions. "Guess it's time to head back," he said, glancing at Deus, who nodded in agreement. Together they stepped out of the cave and into the dying light, their minds already turning toward the next steps in their uncertain journey. But for now, the forest was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, so was Nyx's mind. As Nyx and Deus made their way back toward town, the cool night air settled over the island, carrying with it the scent of the sea. The once lively streets were quiet now, with only the occasional creak of the docks or distant laughter from a tavern cutting through the stillness. "Are we going to Favi's?" Deus asked, his concern for their injured friend still weighing on him. "Deus, relax. Even in the best-case scenario, he's sleeping like a dead man right now," Nyx replied, waving a hand dismissively. "How about the inn? Aren't you supposed to be in some sort of drinking contest?" Deus blinked, remembering. "Right!" His face brightened at the thought, and the two set off for the tavern in the harbour. The walk was quiet, save for the occasional clang of a boat's chain or the distant call of a gull. The air was chilly, the kind of cold that crawls beneath your skin, yet it felt fitting, a strange calm after the chaos of the day. "Funny," Nyx muttered as they walked. "How on this island, a peaceful stroll can turn into a fucking bloodbath." Deus nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts churned with indecision. What now? Should he rejoin the guards? Or maybe the monastery, where at least there was order and discipline? His mechanical body didn't need much rest, but his mind was weary from all the choices that lay ahead. "I guess I've got until tomorrow to figure it out," he muttered to himself. As they approached the tavern, its wooden doors glowing with the warmth of candlelight, a familiar figure stood waiting. Varric. The man was positioned in front of the entrance, arms crossed like a guard before the gates of a fortress, his posture proud and arrogant. "Oh, there you are again," Varric sneered. "Well, let's get this gold of yours jumping off." Deus narrowed his eyes, already irritated by the man's audacity. How can someone be such a boor, he thought, suppressing the urge to flatten the man where he stood. A moment of silence passed between them, the tension thick in the air. Varric, ever impatient, pulled out a spiked baton from his belt, twirling it in his hand. His eyes flicked over to Nyx, or, Varric added, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "I could take the maiden here instead of gold. Wouldn't mind that at all." Deus's insides boiled with fury at the insult, but he glanced over at Nyx for approval. The warlock, exhausted and barely engaged, gave a small, tired nod, not bothering to hide his disdain. It was all the permission Deus needed. Deus stepped forward, standing tall, his full height easily towering over Varric, and stared him down. "You'll get nothing tonight. Now move." Deus growled, his voice low but resonating with authority. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but it was clear that he wasn't about to take any of Varric's bullshit. Varric, momentarily intimidated by Deus's size, faltered, but living in the harbor had hardened him, and he wasn't about to back down so easily. If you didn't fight for what was yours here, you lost it. Without another word, Varric lunged at Deus, swinging his baton hard. The weapon struck Deus's armor with a deafening clang, then again, each blow ringing hollow against the impenetrable metal. Deus sighed internally. He had hoped to avoid this, but with a quick calculation of force and precision, he balled his hand into a fist and delivered a single, well-aimed punch. He intended it as a warning, a show of dominance, just enough to send Varric a message. But years on the front lines had sharpened Deus's instincts, and he had forgotten how much weaker normal men were. The blow sent Varric flying, his body crashing through a decaying wooden fence before landing with a tremendous splash in the cold ocean waters. For a brief moment there was silence as Deus stared at the spot where Varric had disappeared into the dark waters. Realizing what he had done, Deus's eyes widened in alarm. He immediately began searching for a rope, his body moving into overdrive to correct the unintended show of force. Meanwhile, Nyx, who had been watching the whole exchange with mild interest, suddenly broke into hysterical laughter. He doubled over, barely able to catch his breath as he watched Deus frantically search for something to pull Varric out of the water. He even had to unbutton his shirt to stop from busting the seams with his uncontrollable mirth. Eventually, Varric was fished out of the water, his body drenched and shaking from the cold. He slumped against the wall of the tavern, glaring up at Deus, but clearly too broken, physically and mentally, to continue the fight. Deus, still stressed from the whole situation, stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of how to apologize for nearly killing the man. Nyx, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, shook his head and patted Deus on the shoulder. "Today has been exhausting," he said, still catching his breath. "I think I'm going to call it a night." Deus nodded, relieved. "Yeah, you should rest. Take care of yourself." With that, Nyx turned and made his way. The day had been long and the night wasn't over yet, but for now, they had a brief moment of peace, however chaotic it had come to be. The tavern was alive with energy. Drunken laughter, the clatter of dice, and the shuffle of cards filled the smoky air. Every table was occupied, tankards overflowing with frothy ale, and the sound of slurred banter was constant. Deus scanned the room, and near the bar a familiar voice rang out. "Hey, giant, over here." A local security guard waved him over, a broad grin on his face. Deus recognized him from his earlier visits to the harbor. He approached, shaking hands with the man, whose grip was firm but friendly. "They call me Deus," he said, introducing himself with a nod. The guard laughed heartily. "Hello, Deus. They call me Borka, the speck of all specks." Deus raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the nickname. Speck of all specks, huh? And what do you specialize in? Borka chuckled, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. I, my dear Deus, specialize in supplying the local dialect with happiness in life. He laughed again, clearly proud of his ambiguous answer. Let's just say I make sure the good people here don't run out of things to keep them smiling. Deus grinned, amused by the man's light-heartedness. Well, what shall we start with then? My throat's as dry as the Garata wilderness. With that, the two set to drinking, tankards quickly appearing before them. The night pressed on, and the tavern's lively atmosphere wrapped around them, offering a brief respite from the day's earlier turmoil. Meanwhile, Nyx had other plans. While Deus indulged in his drinking contest, Nyx walked the shadowy streets of the harbor, his footsteps soft against the cobblestone path. His mind raced with unanswered questions, and something gnawed at him, an itch that wouldn't be satisfied until he confronted it head-on. He made his way to the warehouse where he had once attempted to retrieve a package, the one that still held some importance in his mind. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and seemingly abandoned at this hour. Slowly, Nyx pushed the door open, the creak of the old wood barely registering in the silent night. Inside, a lone figure leaned against a wooden beam, barely awake. The man, a simple guard, swayed as if sleepwalking, his head bobbing up and down in a battle to stay conscious. Nyx couldn't help but smirk at the man's sorry state. This was almost too easy. He quietly snuck closer, and with exaggerated authority he cleared his throat. "Change! Get the fuck out of here already!" Nyx barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Startled awake, the guard jumped, eyes wide with shock. Without even stopping to question the odd situation, he nodded obediently and rushed out of the building, disappearing into the night. Nyx chuckled to himself, finding humor in the man's hasty retreat. Now alone, he surveyed the warehouse. The smell of damp wood and salt lingered in the air, mingling with the faint odor of fish and oil. The dim light of the moon filtered through cracks in the walls, casting long shadows between the rows of crates. Nyx walked into the middle of the room, the weight of his thoughts growing heavier with each step. "Okay, where do I start?" he muttered to himself. He lowered himself to the ground, crossing his legs into the lotus position. His hands rested on his knees as he closed his eyes, sinking deeper into meditation, trying to unravel the tangled thoughts in his mind. As he ventured further into his own consciousness, the feeling of something foreign, something dark, began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a whisper in the back of his mind, but it grew more tangible, as if the shadows themselves were wrapping around him, enveloping him in their cold embrace. Nyx could feel the presence, as real as if someone were standing behind him, breathing down his neck. The sensation was unsettling, yet strangely familiar, like an old memory surfacing after years of dormancy. But just as he tried to glimpse what it was, to lift the veil of mystery surrounding the sensation, it vanished. The darkness receded, leaving Nyx frustrated and grasping at nothing. "Fuck!" he cursed, irritated by his own failure. Determined, Nyx tried again. He rose from the ground and paced the room, his fingers tracing the edges of crates and beams as if trying to anchor himself. The warehouse, once crowded with crates, now felt empty, echoing his isolation. As he moved, something bizarre happened. Nyx felt the air shift, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him. His fingers brushed against something solid but invisible, like touching his own reflection in a mirror, yet with no mirror in sight. In the dark, a figure appeared before him, identical to himself, their forms touching face to face, like a warped version of reality staring back at him. Nyx's heart raced. The figure was him, but not quite. It mirrored his movements, its fingers grazing his cheek as if it were a tangible reflection pulled from his thoughts. The eerie encounter stretched on, the tension between him and his doppelganger thick, until finally the strain of it all overwhelmed him. Exhausted by the surreal experience, Nyx stumbled backward and collapsed into a deep, dreamless sleep on the cold floor. The mysteries still lingered, but for now his mind would rest. Deus was in high spirits, his laughter ringing out among the raucous crowd of the tavern where the drunken revelry was at its peak. Borka had just lost the drinking contest, and the room erupted in shouts and cheers. "Hey Borka, you probably won't let the guard drink, haha. Someone jeered, egging on the spectacle. Deus and Borka, their tankards raised high in anticipation of a final toast, could feel the eyes of the room upon them. But Borka, clearly outmatched, couldn't hold his liquor any longer. With a clumsy tilt, he tipped his tankard over and fell forward onto the tabletop, sending ale splattering across the surface and pooling on the floor. The tavern erupted with laughter, the sound bouncing off the walls like a celebratory chorus. Realizing that his friend was about to make a mess of himself, Deus stood up with a chuckle. "All right, party's over for you, buddy," he declared, scooping up Borka's limp body and carrying him outside into the cool night air. As they exited, Deus caught sight of Nyx standing in front of the tavern. He looked a bit paler than usual, but Deus brushed it off as just the moonlight playing tricks on him. "Weren't you supposed to go to sleep?" Deus asked, raising an eyebrow in concern. "There's so much noise in this inn, you can hear it all the way at the main gate," Nyx replied with a laugh, his voice tinged with both amusement and exasperation. He stepped forward to help Deus carry the inebriated Borka, who was mumbling incoherently as they navigated the streets. They eventually reached the Blue Lantern, a notorious establishment known for its discreet pleasures and sultry ambience. The atmosphere was strikingly different from the chaotic tavern they had just left. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the soft sounds of music filled the dimly lit room. Men lounged on plush carpets, their eyes glued to the scantily clad women dancing gracefully around them, a scene steeped in temptation and desire. Deus felt a wave of awkwardness wash over him. He instinctively turned his gaze away, trying to shield his eyes from the alluring sights around him. However, it seemed the patrons were more interested in Nyx than in the dancers. Curious glances turned his way, as if sensing something unique about him, something that caught their interest more than the entertainment unfolding before them. As Deus carefully carried Borka toward the stairs leading to the rooms, he overheard the manager of the Blue Lantern speaking to Nyx, his tone smooth and persuasive. "You look like someone who appreciates a good arrangement, my friend. We could work together for something truly profitable," the manager said, a sly smile creeping across his face. Deus paused for a moment, concerned about the implications of the conversation. He set Borka down against the wall and shot Nyx a questioning glance. "What kind of arrangement?" he asked, his voice low enough not to draw the attention of the other patrons. Nyx shrugged, his expression unreadable as he replied, "Just talking business, I guess. Nothing I'm interested in." Still feeling uneasy, Deus straightened up and nodded toward Borka. "Let's get him settled before we dive into anything too shady. We can't leave him here to drown in his own stupidity." They both laughed, though Nyx's laughter held a hint of nervousness. They continued to carry Borka toward the stairs, leaving behind the mesmerizing chaos of the Blue Lantern, unsure of what the night had in store for them next.